How the minimum wage keeps people poor. The minimum wage is one of the most pernicious laws currently enforced. Not necessarily the concept itself, although there is an argument, but more how high it is set. The idea behind the policy is that because of the never-ending war between workers and owners, and because owners, supposedly, have undue power over workers, the government needs to step in and set a minimum standard of pay. But is that what the minimum wage actually does? Well, not really. And while the idea of a $15 an hour minimum wage sounds nice and all, the unintended consequences of the policy are far from helpful. The free market is neither kind nor unkind. It just is, like gravity or math. A misconception many have is that the free market is something humans have created, and therefore something humans can control. But just because the Soviet Union really wanted to control the market didn't mean that they were able to do so. In fact, every attempt they made to control it ended with the misallocation of their resources, and in some cases, these misallocations led to the starvation of citizens who had been able to feed themselves before the government's meddling. For proof, see what happened in Ukraine after the kulaks were exterminated. The USSR made the same mistake that the left is currently making. They thought they would be able to control a force of nature. But who in their right mind would try to stop a hurricane by legislating it, or by attempting to reason with it? To understand why the minimum wage does not work, we need to understand some things about the free market. First, all parties are price takers. Second, a worker must provide value at least equal to the cost of them being hired. And third, capital will always flow to the area of least resistance. The first point means that employers and workers do not set wages. The market does. I will save explaining this in depth for its own video because it really does deserve it. The basic idea is that since all employers in a certain market are in competition with one another for the same pool of labor, no individual employer is able to underpay. Because if they do, the supply of labor will simply work for employers that are willing to pay them their proper wages. Similarly, all workers in a certain market are also in competition with one another, ensuring that employers will not be forced to overpay their workers. If one worker wants to be paid more than their economic worth, then the job will simply go to a different potential worker who is willing to work for their proper wages. The second point should not require much explanation. Would you hire someone who will not make back the value you give them? I think not. The best way I can explain the third point is to use your knowledge of science. If you recall, gases will spread out in their containers so that each area has the same concentration. This is called diffusion. Capital diffuses just like gases do. In the free market, a capitalist has many options when they are considering where they will allocate their capital. And they will generally decide to put their capital where it will give the highest return. Or in other words, the area where capital is least concentrated. These three truths are part of the reason a minimum wage that is set too high has such negative consequences. Because everyone in a free market is a price taker, there exists a market-clearing wage, based on many different factors. If the minimum wage is set above the market-clearing wage for a market, then the potential worker is no longer worth hiring. And since capital flows towards the area of least resistance, firms that would usually employ low-skilled workers in a free market setting may decide to hire less workers, invest in automation, or simply close their business and move their capital to a different market altogether. The implications of low-skilled workers being unable to find work are, quite frankly, devastating to those workers who need low-skilled jobs. The truth is that low-paid jobs are not meant to be careers, whatever the left might tell you. They are meant to be stepping stones to real jobs. If your life's ambition is to work the till at Walmart, then you need to reevaluate what you're doing. However, if you want to use that Walmart job to work your way up to being a manager, or you're using it to gain valuable workplace experience, then that job is very important to you, and to be denied it by the minimum wage will have real long-term effects on your life. If you are unable to get that entry-level position, then how are you supposed to be able to get a good job with which you can support a family? How can you gain the confidence, skills, and knowledge to open your own business? The simple answer is that you will be relying on the goodwill of potential employers to give you the first chance at work, at their loss. By forcing low-skilled individuals to rely on charity from employers, they are being cheated out of a life that could be so much more fulfilling. It is true that there is a wage gap between whites and non-Asian minorities, and one of the major causes of this gap is indeed the minimum wage. Because minorities, blacks especially, so often come from such broken homes, and with the baggage of such situations attached, they are less able to get an entry-level job than whites and Asians. To understand why potential employers are more likely to hire whites and Asians, think about this from the employer's perspective. If, In general, non-Asian minorities are less likely to be productive employees because of their poor home life. Can you blame employers for choosing those who are more likely to be productive individuals if they are going to be operating at a loss by hiring them? Even if the reason they are less likely to be as productive has nothing to do with their own choices, from the employer's perspective, it would be more efficient for their firm to choose, on average, the individuals they believe their investment are more likely to pay off on. If the minimum wage did not exist, they could be hired at a cheaper rate at first, allowing them to prove that they can be a productive worker. As with most unfair and unjust laws, there is a group of people who benefit from the suffering of common citizens. In this case, labor unions. The reason labor unions fight for a higher minimum wage is quite simple. They want to make the labor of their members worth as much as possible so that they can charge high union dues. The real-world effect of a high minimum wage is that the supply of labor shrinks, and as with anything, when the supply shrinks without any other changes to the market, the price goes up. If there are fewer people competing for a position, then those who do have the skills are able to charge more for their labor. This is why highly educated workers are so well paid. If becoming a doctor took 3 years and was less costly, then each individual doctor would be forced to take lower salary due to the increased competition for the same positions. Alternatively, if becoming a doctor became harder, pricing more people out of the occupation, each individual who is able to become a doctor would be able to charge more for their services. It is for this reason that labor unions push for a high minimum wage. The fight for a higher minimum wage is proof that the left, well, more accurately the socialist left, does not care about poor people. They simply hate rich people. If they cared about poor people, they would want them to get the entry-level positions they need to acquire skills and experience. If they cared about poor people, they would do what is necessary for them to get a good job that will allow them to buy a house and start a family. If they cared about poor people, they would stop bending them over so that labor unions can have their way with them. If they cared about poor people, they would stop pushing for an ever higher minimum wage.